Morena whānau, mīno i tātou. Manawa mai te mauri nuku, manawa mai te mauri rangi. Kei au te mauri tipua, kei au te mauri tāwhito, kei au te mauri nōhia. No tiki tiki o rangi, no te waioro o tāne te waioro. Tēnei te mauri ka whakapiki, tēnei te mauri ka whakakake. Tēnei te mauri ka puta ki te whai au ki te ao marama, ki te matatauira e tuake nei. Uhi, wero, tau mai te mauri, haumi e hui e, tā ki e. Hand it to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. So the process that we'll be following is that once the meeting is opened, there is a schedule, and thank you for coming to present on behalf of your submission. And as you submit, I'll ask you to come forward. We have the speakers on so that the meeting can be recorded. And we have this terribly smart new timer, which you'll notice there, which will record the time that you're speaking. You've each got 10 minutes, plus there'll be 5 minutes for questions, and I won't be really tough on that. We need to truly understand what it is that you are bringing to us. So we'll use that as a general time frame, but not be hard and fast. There's one other thing on that. Oh, when you come to speak, you don't need to stand. You can sit or stand, and you don't need the microphone right in front of you. It is quite sensitive and pick it up from a metre away. So generally we'll sit, and I will do that now. I'll call for apologies, and there are none. Both of the councillors to be a part of this hearing panel are present. I'll ask for any declarations of interest. No? No? Thank you. There are no notices of motion, and the report is the hearings report for today. One item that I do need to do, we had one late submission, which was received slightly after closing date time, that from Dr. Aisha Viral as Associate Minister of Health.
I'm in receipt of that late submission, Madam Chair.
Thank you. It's been moved and seconded that the late submission of Dr. Aisha Viral be accepted. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, carried. Thank you. So we all know that we're here today to consider submissions on the Gisborne District Council's new draft wastewater bylaw for 2021. And so to start our meeting, I'll invite Mr. Ian Ruru to come forward and present your submission. And bring, if you wish to bring anyone with you, feel free.
Maunga haumi te maunga, ko waipao te awa, ko taitanga maha ki te iwi.
Just before you start, I shall introduce the council officers reporting on this bylaw hearing. So for a matter of completeness, so I welcome Tracy Patton, thank you, who is reporting as the wastewater treatment team leader, and slightly engaged with Ms. Conn at the moment is Charlotte Knight for GDC. Just so everyone in the room understands who's present, we have Mr. Wilson and our lead planner with us today. Thank you, Joe Noble. Over to you, Mr. Ruru. Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, it's an honour and a privilege to present today on behalf of Taitanga Mahaki, Rongo Whakata, mai Tamanuhiri, as part of Te Runanga o Tūranga Nui a Kiwa. I'm also here, Kanohi Kitea for the Kiwa group, and we have Ngāti Ononi, Ngāriki Kaiputahi, Te Whānau Kai, and I think that's probably a couple more, but yeah, it is an honour and a privilege on behalf of tangata whenua that hold mana whenua, mana moana and mana awa over this area. So I'm also here representing those that have passed before us. have passed on that rārākau, the wero, to continue this particular kaupapa, a kaupapa that started 55 years ago when the wastewater treatment pipe was put into the bay, and from that very second, the abhorrence to human waste going into our moana was articulated, but not necessarily heard. So I'm continuing on from those that have gone before, those that are present today, and just as importantly for future generations. Representing a lot of people, a lot of tangata whenua, and I guess we're not going away. We're going to be here, this hearing and the next and the next. And this is a marathon, not a sprint. So I'm taking our time and persistent and stubborn to supporting what we see as, in this particular context, one step towards restoring the mauri of Tūranga Nui Aotearoa. Also in a New Zealand nationwide context, Te Mana o Te Wai is finally a thing within the Crown and regional councils. And this is another example, or this is a particular example of giving effect to Te Mana o Te Wai, upholding those traditions, the importance of our awa, our moana, giving the mana back, restoring the mana, upholding the mana of the water itself. So this particular bylaw, we can see in that context, fits exactly with how Tai Rāwhiti, iwi, hapu and whānau wish to uphold Te Mana o Te Wai. So yes, we are fully supportive. If I put my Kiwa Group hat on, we're fully supportive. We have been fully engaged. We had some robust discussions within our iwi and hapu with the council staff, and we're able to come through to a very successful outcome, a positive outcome, not only for mana whenua, but also for the whole community. Two reasons why we support the bylaw: that will prohibit mortuary liquids from entering the municipal sewage system. The first being the respect and dignity that we owe to our tūpāpaku. The ultimate tapu, the ultimate sacredness. We seem to have this sort of position where, okay, we have through our funeral homes and the dignity and respect is there, but we're missing this vital point where fluids from those processes enter our municipal wastewater system. So respect and dignity for our tūpāpaku is our first reason why we support this bylaw. The second being protection of our mahinga kai. As we know, from the municipal system goes up to the sea. During heavy rainfall, overflows, it goes straight into our awa. Ko te awa, ko te awa ko au, I'm the river is me. So what we desecrate our rivers, we desecrate ourselves. So we also wanted to protect our mahinga kai and our whānau that participate, enjoy, live on the rivers, and live on the East Coast. Those are our two fundamental reasons why we see this bylaw fitting in with both tikanga, environmental protection, and also affordable solution for this particular matter. Just a point on tikanga, I asked the uncles how to approach this, and they said ka koe te tikanga, ka marae, whānau, hapu. So tikanga rests with the tangata whenua involved, and I sort of asked what that meant, and they said, oh, make sure you stick in your lane. So what we do, what I represent, the people I represent, we're sticking to it in our lane, and we found a solution that works for us. I think that's about all I can say. I'm happy to prefer to have some questions if I've missed anything or want some clarification.
Thank you. I'd just like to, you go first, Councillor Foster.
Yeah, thank you, Ian. The other aspects of the trade waste bylaw, you and your representatives are supportive of all the other aspects of this?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Ruru, for that background. Can you confirm for us that you're comfortable with the slightly modification of the terminology under mortuary what mortuary means? Now, you don't have the document in front of you, but you will have seen it because it has been provided to you. the wording has been modified by council officers. It is not quite as Ron Whakaata's submission was reported. But do you have any comment on that? And Ms. Conn can probably provide you with a copy if you don't have one. Or I will share mine.
I'm totally supportive of anything that makes the process.
It's just
smoother
very
and
specific
streamlined.
for the detail, which is actually an important part of the submission process today. It doesn't change the intent. Page 6 of 64. And it's just the option 3, and you'll see mortuary has been given clarity.
Okay, yeah. Yes, I'm okay with that, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's effectively confirms your participation.
I thank you, and for opportunity, as I say, to represent tangata whenua on this particular kaupapa. It's an important one to us. And also acknowledge GDC that has been part of the Kiwa group as well, helping us with all the technicalities behind this. So yeah, it has been a very positive engagement, genuine and authentic relationships have been forged. So appreciate
Sure.
it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mr. Palmer's not presenting. Is that correct, Ms. Conn, or is there someone in the audience presenting on behalf of Mr. Palmer? No? Right. Mr. David Moser, on behalf of the Funeral Directors Association, I appreciate you're here. I appreciate that we're a little ahead of time, but if all of your participation and the people that you want with you are here, are you happy to go to take your presentation now? Thank you very much. Please come forward. Thank you very much.
Ke whea koutou a kāngaro nei o wā a tērā ka i roki mai au. I te hunga o te kahurangi ka o te atu koutou e hika mai e. Ati hei o mauri o rā. Ati hei uri i te hei noko whakatauha a te rangi e tui ho nei. A whakatauha a te papi raro nei. A whakatauha a te mātuku mai ke rarotonga. A koi au ki hio mano poroto. A koi au ki hia o mana hau waho. A whakatina ki a tina te mori mai ki Hawaii. He pupu ana, he wawana hoki te rewa tū ana ki te rangi ko heke. Heke tangaroa, heke pānuku, heke whano haramai te toki, haumi e, ui e, tai ki e. Ko wai a hau. Ko mana waru, te maunga, te mātātua, te waka, o hine mataroa te awa, te poho o kuri kino te marae, ngāti kuri te hapu, ngai tahu, ngai tūhoi, te iwi, ko Alan Poke tōku ingoa. Ka mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. Tēnei a hau e mihi ana ki a koutou e ngā uri o Turanga Nui a Kiwa. Koutou hoki e te kaunihera, me ngā whānau e noho nei ki te tairawhiti. Tēnā koutou a ngā mihi nui koutou katoa. First and foremost, I stand here today to bring the acknowledgement and the aroha and the love of both the National Organisation of the Funeral Directors and Embalmers Association of New Zealand. I must say outright that we collectively commend and support the mahi of especially our Kiwa organisation, Ian, over the many years of mahi, those who have passed on doing this mahi, mato tupuna, with the aspirations of excluding the wastewater from our awa, from our moana, within the Turanga Akiwa region to maintain the Māori. Ko Waiaho has myself as being Māori with over 30 years of experience within this industry. A qualified and frontline clinician in both embalming and funeral directing, and owner and operator of Tangihanga Funeral Homes in the Te Taitokero Northern region, Tamaki Makaurau, our Auckland region, Te Whanganui Atara, our Wellington region, and soon to be Te Arawa in our Rotorua region, serving the needs of our Māori whānau with tangihanga. As one of New Zealand's largest privately owned funeral homes, my organisation is both proud and privileged in serving nearly 1,000 families annually, both directly and indirectly, to which Māori make up more than 85% of this number. Out of that number, 90% of our whānau offer embalming for their loved ones to enable presentation, preservation, and sanitation. Also due to the fact that they are predominantly urban Māori, therefore long travel distances are often required in returning them back to Te Haukainga from the place where they have come. Although it is regretful that us as the frontline clinicians to this profession had never been initially part of this journey from its outset for exclusion of the water waste bylaw, it is our hopeful intention to delay its inception until further dialogue can be afforded with ourselves. As the frontline clinicians, I do believe that the resources, the industry expertise, the best practice alternatives from a national collective network platform are but some offerings that may better contribute to a more robust model, upholding the mana and the tikanga whilst achieving the end result of restoring the Māori to our moana. It is therefore no secret that this bylaw is being observed by other councils throughout the Motu. We are aware of that. And it is therefore prudent that an opportunity be afforded the New Zealand Funeral Directors and Embalmers Association to positively contribute and therefore actively support any such subsequent rollout on a national scale that this may have. But this is where we must first get it right. Bio-waste from our tūpapaku, as Ian mentioned, is sacred. And the reticulation process for this bio-waste should not be determined by investigative versus interment circumstantial outcomes. If our end goal is to prohibit the waste from entering our moana, and specifically in this point in Poverty Bay, then from a tikanga perspective, there should be no exceptions or compromise as prescribed in its current form. This is only but one example of compromising ourselves by not making this bylaw fully inclusive, regardless of both the cause and circumstances of one's passing. I am confident that there are more robust and holistic solutions that may accommodate such challenges. Furthermore, it is also regrettable that we feel, as a combined organisation, that this bylaw has been dictated to our industry without any consultation whatsoever, and left only at our front doorstep for us, the clinicians, to deal with. thus using the term interment as a platform of convenience. Funeral home establishments are not, and I say are not, the only locations that are utilised for the post-death preparation, and we therefore seek further clarification and dialogue as to widening the scope on what constitutes the term interment preparation. At our first and last hui, we were advised by council that the pipes will be closed off to mortuary waste. Complete closure of the pipes are not our concern, our area of concern. We totally support tautoko and agree with that. It is the fact that they exclude other entities that deal with tūpapaku, whether they be public and private hospitals, rest homes, coronial services, or emergency response services, etc. These elude our want for both a pure and all-inclusive outcome for this bylaw in its current standing. To E Ruru and our Kiwa organisation, we wish to both acknowledge and support this kaupapa. We really do. And the vision, the planning, and the mahi that has been done. I make both a personal plea and a professional commitment to your rōpū and to our people that our national organisations, if given an opportunity, will work collectively alongside yourselves in order to fulfil the needs of those that you represent. Kia tātou tēnei e whakataka, ana i te huarahi tika mō o mātou uri kia whai atu, nā te mea ko rātou nā rangatira mō a pōpō. We are here today to pave the path for our future generations to follow, for they are our leaders of tomorrow. Anga mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Before I sit down, I would like to both introduce our mātua kai whakahaere, ko David Mauja, our FDANZ CEO, inga iwi ngā reo, tēnei te whare, anga mihi atu kia koutou katoa, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai tātou.
Kia ora, thank you.
Kia ora.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nō Plimerton aho, ko Moja te whānau, ko David aho, ko English Channel te moana, ko Medway te awa, ko Ruapehu te maunga. I hara ahua i te tangata mohio, ki te korero o tira i tika ana, kia mihi atu, kia mihi mai, ka nui te mihi, kia koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for this opportunity to address you today. And I'm here in my capacity as the Chief Executive of the Funeral Directors Association. Our members account for more than 75% of all registered deaths across New Zealand, and we have a breadth of experience and expertise that we very much want to bring to bear to help support the work that you're doing here. As Alan has said, we fully support the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve, which we understand to be the removal of wastewater going into the moana, and also the future opportunity for recycling of water to improve your local economy. I wish to focus my remarks today on the unintended consequences that the proposed bylaw will have, and to seek further, as Alan has said, consultation on these before this bylaw be considered for approval. Now, the context here is that based upon the DIA registered statistics for deaths in the first quarter of this year for the Gisborne area, and taking into account the current level of embalming that's undertaken across those registered deaths, and a national basis of the amount of water that's actually put through the process, we're talking today about a bylaw that affects 0.003% of your daily discharge into your wastewater system. And our contention is that the unintended consequences of enabling this bylaw for such a small percentage of that daily discharge won't collectively achieve the outcomes that you're looking to achieve. And in fact, the unintended consequences significantly outweigh the consequential issues that would be created from this system. The issue of the definition of mortuary wastewater as being made up of arterial blood and chemicals doesn't take into account that these same contaminants are present across the other 99.997% of your daily discharge. And these unintended consequences will not have the outcome that you're looking to achieve of removing the perception of the difficulties of dealing with water that has been in contact with the Tupapaku. Another unintended consequence is the impact on the mental well-being of your local community. The Ministry of Health recognises the need for a funeral, for a meaningful farewell as part of a healthy grieving process. In documentation from the Ministry, it clearly states that the removal of such a process has detrimental mental well-being impact. And that's why it needs to be protected, even in the face of a global pandemic. Now, it must be remembered that funeral directors are businesses. They're not funded by any Ministry of Health or any other government funding in that respect. And as such, any costs that are imposed upon the industry through the provision of this bylaw and its targeted impact will have to be passed on to the consumers. The problem with that is that those consumers generally will be those who struggle to meet those costs already, and for whom the need for that meaningful farewell is culturally significant. What this means is that those vulnerable people who are facing grief in the loss of one of their loved ones are then forced with having to make the decision of, do we take on more debt to pay for the costs to enable embalming, which enables extended viewing, which contributes to that meaningful farewell? Or do we forego that and face the issues of dealing with those mental health issues that are clearly evident both from our own practice, but also from ministry documentation? The side issue here is, in addition to being a personal health issue, there is a public health issue. During the COVID-19 period, it was identified that only registered funeral directors could manage Tupapaku. The reason for that, of course, is that if they are not dealt with effectively, then there are public health issues with the effects of decomposition and the other elements that I won't go into, which are quite, can be very unpleasant at that time. The issues of public health there and the impact on personal well-being are clear and obvious. Now, we know from our current national advocacy for the WINS grant that the government are not minded to keep the WINS grant, funeral grant, aligned with funeral price inflation. It has therefore already fallen significantly behind and now represents a far too small a percentage of average funeral costs across New Zealand. The implementation of this act, this bylaw as it sits at the moment, will further increase that cost. And what we won't see is WINS making a regional allowance for increased costs. This will therefore then put that greater financial burden and force families to make very hard decisions at a time when they are least equipped to do with it because of the ravages of grief. The unintended consequence of this economic impact, we believe, is out of proportion with the effect on 0.03% of your daily wastewater discharge. The proposed bylaw as it stands doesn't include a definition wide enough to actually deal with the perception and the cultural barriers that have been identified against the future use of trade wastewater. And that is one of the fundamental drivers noted throughout the Council's website for the creation of this bylaw. In addition to that unintentional consequence on the local community for personal well-being, for public health, the fact that the wider impact doesn't bear witness and doesn't bear relevance to a 0.003% reduction. And I keep referring to that because it is a key issue that the local community will struggle to accept when they are faced with their own having to bear an increased financial burden at a time when they are least able to cope with it financially and mentally. Given more time, we can identify more of these unintended consequences and also help craft a response that will meet both the needs of the council and the local community in terms of the protection of the moana and the ability for the future recycling of the water into the local economy. And we can also help work with the council to manage the risk of potential consequences of these actions. As Alan has said, we're here because we want to help support what you're doing, and we believe that we can assist you in doing that. But the current proposal as it stands, we believe has significant issues and unintended consequences that will not be beneficial to your local community. Thank you for your time.
Apeti hono tata hono ko honga mate ki te honga mate. Apeti hono tata hono ki honga ora ki te honga ora oreira e ngā iwi, i ngā mana, e ngā reo ho tēnei te whare. Tēnā koutou, anga mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, he waiata e poto. Tēnei ahau, he moko puna, o te taira whiti. Kia hori, kia ora tātou.
Thank you. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We appreciate the significant impact statements you've made with respect to unintended consequences. I'd just like to ask you a couple of questions around other matters that you raised in line with your request for further time. You talk about, you've responded particularly to the suggestion that the waste be tankered, and you suggest that there might be other options. Are you in a position to share what your thinking is along those lines today?
Yeah, I think there are other ways around the country that these matters have been dealt with. We can put forward some of those, but I think without the context of how that would fit with your own tikanga and local practices, I'd be firing out ideas. But through conversations around the country, because this has been an issue that we have discussed nationally as an association, we have a number of members who have already lined up and said, we have been involved in these kinds of discussions, we have experience in this space, and we would be very happy to be involved in providing and discussing what those options are. Because at this point, from the national perspective, we believe that we haven't had that opportunity of engagement, and we haven't had the opportunity to share with you the experience across the whole of the country and what those solutions could look like. The other element as well, I don't want to miss out on, is that the experience that we have across the association, I have seen very creative solutions to issues that have been discussed at our national and district events. And I have been, quite frankly, overwhelmed by the solutions that have been arrived at through that iterative and collaborative process. So I wouldn't want to restrict to some of the things that are done around the country, because I think your circumstances are unique. And I think there are sufficient minds around the country that will understand your situation, but also be able to bring expertise to create some solutions.
Thank you for that. I mean, consultation began on this process in February of this year. Was it not drawn to your attention way back then?
No.
No, thank you. Did I see you with a question?
Yeah, it was along similar lines, actually. I know this conversation has been had for the last 2 years in our wastewater management committee, and it's a public council committee. So yeah, so this has been over 2 years in the process. Wisconsin Mound process is an international renowned process for this activity. So yeah, I'm the same actually. I'm just wondering why the delay in coming forward with your concerns now. And I know this is probably the right opportunity to do it at a hearing, but and with no other options to bring to the table of how else it could be treated before. And in our particular instance, where we've got that going into the ocean as well.
So, on that point, I think two comments to make. Firstly, as soon as we did become aware, we engaged strongly, and Alan and I came here to Gisborne. We had a hui up at the council offices to show really how we are committed to helping in the process. And hopefully from the comments that I've made today, you can see that there is further input and expertise that we can bring to bear into the process to create an outcome that will achieve what you want to achieve, but we'll do it in a way that brings the expertise that we have in dealing with the topography. In terms of the Wisconsin Mound, that's a very interesting concept. It is but one of a number of different options. And one of the points that I made in the submission is that it does consistently look as though that is the solution that will be enacted as a result of this bylaw. Indeed, in the papers for today's meeting, the timeline for the future even refers to when the construction of the Wisconsin Mound will start. And so we do not think, and certainly from our perspective, we have not had the opportunity to work with council on the wider range of options that are available. And so it's almost as if the conclusion of the bylaw has been made already. And I know there are a couple of statements that say, well, no, things could still change. But when you read in documents that here is the intended date of when the work will start, that suggests a line of thinking which doesn't include the wider consultation that from a national perspective we can bring. So I think the process can result in a better outcome because in your situation, the Wisconsin Mound approach and the issues of then dealing with septic tanks and tankering of water around has all sorts of other issues relating to both the respect for the tupapaki, the tikanga of and how that is worked through, and the practicalities of dealing with that kind of system. So our contention is that we can bring expertise and creativity to help craft a solution that we feel will present a better outcome than what currently appears to have been locked in place given the papers that we've seen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. No questions? Can I just ask our council officer, can you confirm or give any indication of the quantum of mortuary wastewater that might go to our wastewater outfall in any quarter or the first 3 months of this year, as was described by the gentleman in their presentation?
There was some work done with the local funeral director about how much water was used per person, but there was some discussion about maybe that was a little bit on the high side. So I don't actually have a clear indication of how much water that would be. I think we were talking. Sorry, I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head that they had discussed. They had put a water meter in.
Mr. Wilson is trying to tell me. Thank you.
Through
Thank
you,
you,
Madam.
Mr. Wilson.
Through you, Madam Chair, it's roughly between 800 litres to 1,000 litres per body is used. There's around 5 to 12, depending on the week, deaths per week in Tairāwhiti. Not always that high. So on maths of that, maybe 5,000 litres a week. So you're talking 20,000 litres, so 60,000 litres over that 3-month period if you were talking about that, roughly.
So is that 0.003% of the water that goes to the wastewater outfall?
It would be minuscule compared to the amount of water going through. The quantum is not large, given that plant runs at 120 odd litres a second at the moment, probably Tracy, up to 450 litres a second in heavy rain events.
Thank you very much.
If I may, Madam Chairman, the basis for the calculation is there were 91 registered deaths from the DIA statistics in the first quarter of this year. We have made an allowance for 50% of embalming, which is the current rate of embalming reported by our member Evans Funeral Services here in Gisborne. We've then allowed 1,000 litres per embalming, which, as has been said, is on the high side. And that creates a figure over that period, which divided by the 13,000 cubic metres that is reported to go through your waste disposal system on a daily basis from your council website figures, creates the figure of 0.003%.
Thank you very much. Then there's probably no disagreement on the quantum. Thank you. I just want to ask one other question because, and I really appreciate the information that you have each shared with us, but one of the matters that is under submission and is part of what has been amended is the determination of the word mortuary, and the description is given for that. While I hear what you said in the beginning about that, potentially I take from what you've been saying that it doesn't encompass all of the opportunities for access. Are you generally comfortable with that description of a mortuary? Because that's what we're talking about in here.
Not in terms of what we believe the bylaw is trying to achieve, which is the protection of the minor, because the definition as defined currently relates effectively to one building and one process. And the principles that are stated on the council website for the issue of this bylaw is around particularly the arterial blood and chemicals that are then put into the wastewater system. This is aside from any of the cultural perspective that Alan can speak to far more appropriately than I can. So the issue there is that that 0.003% doesn't take into account all the other areas in which that same waste material comes into the wastewater system. But particularly when we're thinking about hospitals, we're thinking about rest homes, nursing homes. There is actually a coronial facility in the hospital, which is for the identification of the dead, and that includes a process that generates wastewater. The other part to remember out of this is that at 1,000 litres per embalming, the material that is actually produced from that process is highly diluted and in much less concentration than the same materials that come from other sources around your city and district. So our view is that you're not going to achieve the outcome of being able to say, well, this is protecting the moana, and also for the future, this is enabling you to recycle that water, because there are huge amounts of the same issue coming from other facilities in your city that are excluded by your definition. We proposed a definition that said any facility that has processes that are in contact with the tupapaku, because that is the underlying and fundamental issue for that. And from a community perspective, What will actually happen is the cost of doing this, the cost of removing that 0.003% will fall upon a very small population. So in the first quarter of this year, 91 registered deaths, half of which were embalmed. So we're talking about 45 people, 45 families having to bear the cost of that entire process and system on their own to remove 0.003% of your problem. And we think that is inequitable.
Ai te tutai nei rata me nunui ki a kōrua I raro I te maru o ngā mana moana, ngā mana awa, ngā mana tangata, ngā mana whenua, me ngā mana Māori tukuna atu te mihi mai o haki a kōrua. I do, just in line with the percentages that we're talking about, when we talk about percentages of dead human waste and the chemicals that are attached, do you have a percentage of how much embalming accounts for that across networks?
So I'm not sure I understand the question.
Repeat it. You're talking about the embalming rather than the...
Yeah, I'm talking about embalming's contribution in terms of this of a percentage, because I heard you talking about the other ways that arterial blood and chemicals get into our wastewater. I'm interested in knowing what the percentage of that, if you have the percentage, is directly attributed to embalming in terms of human dead waste and the chemicals attached to that process. Do you have that percentage?
I don't have that figure offhand in terms of being able to calculate it. I mean, across the country, there are about 32,000 registered deaths a year in New Zealand. And currently, between 50 and 60% on average are embalmed across that number. So you could, given a little bit of time, we could work through and provide, a better figure for that. In terms of very specifically here for the first quarter of this year, we're talking about 45 deaths, 45,000 litres over a 90-day period, which is 500 litres a day, which then comes up with that figure of 0.003%. We don't know, but we would infer that there is substantially greater quantities coming from other sources, specifically hospital medical care facilities. And those materials will be at a substantially greater concentration because the process of embalming is one that involves flushing and the dilution of the material that is actually produced from the body. So there would need to be a further calculation to say, well, if you've removed X litres of blood from a body and diluted that with 1,000 litres of water compared to the output from an operating theatre and how that is cleansed and worked through, those are some of the calculations that we would work through. But our core point that we can be very clear on today is the very minute percentage of your wastewater doesn't justify the focus on one facility and one part of your community who at that point will fundamentally be very vulnerable at both financial risk and mental well-being risk.
Thank you. We've got that particular point really clearly. Can I just ask council officers, was the hospital asked with respect to its facility, not its mortuary facility, but with respect to the facility of the operating theatres? Does Mr. Wilson want to speak to that?
Through you, Madam Chair, the definition of the mortuary waste is something that's been long discussed with the DHB and mana whenua and our community through the Wastewater Technical Advisory Group. The hospital has its own protocols and procedures when it comes down to operating rooms and how they look after that waste. The discussion with mana whenua and community and the DHB was to exclude those now because of the protocols that they have in place and to focus on the mortuary waste because the mortuary waste was the culturally abhorrent practice that we were looking to remove as part of this bylaw. So the hospital have their practices and mana whenua were okay with that from the conversation. Just checking with them before I speak on behalf of them. So it was something that was approved and was agreed that mortuary waste was the one to be targeted through the bylaw, given the other practices of the DHB.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. Thank you. Mr. Ruru. One further question.
This is we're the first council to implement this bylaw throughout the country. Do you think the decision today will influence other councils to follow a similar route with their waste from mortuaries? Is this a concern that the New Zealand organisation has?
Certainly this aspect has been considered in other parts of the country previously. So approximately 10 years ago, this was considered in Wellington, given that they have a similar outfall, although it is further out. So there was consideration given to a similar approach. I believe it was about 10 years ago, and it was determined that at this point, for a number of the various reasons that we raised today, that it wasn't appropriate to move forward at that space. I am aware from conversations around the country that other councils are mindful of the decisions that are being made here. They do understand that you do have a somewhat unique set of circumstances, but the principles that you are seeking to uphold through this work of the protection of the moana and the opportunity to recycle the water, of course, are very relevant. So as Alan has said, we do think that there's an opportunity here to create a model that could be then used nationally across the country. You, of course, be aware of the work that's happening in terms of the wider water concern issues. You'll also be aware of the work that's going on around the potential consolidation of the DHBs and the health approach. So again, being able to consider this through a national lens, which we believe we can bring and walk alongside you with that, we think would be very beneficial.
Just on the other side of that then, so do you think that because of this situation that we have here, this will encourage a speedy solution nationwide for other councils? This will help to speed up that process, because at the moment it looks like the process has been pretty slow.
Yeah, we work both with national government and local government and DHB authorities around the country on a range of different issues. And I can't speak for how they would determine their individual processes, but what I do know is that when I speak with regional councils or national government departments, that bringing a national perspective is very helpful, because they do recognise that if somebody else has done a lot of the thinking and the heavy lifting beforehand, then in many ways, why reinvent the wheel? And therefore, I think that the opportunity here is one that does have national significance and would have a positive outcome. It is clear that we have not touched on all the unintended consequences or the other issues that we see around the country because of the time that we were looking to work with you today. So there are other elements that can be brought to bear in that respect. And this is a process that is not an easy one. We absolutely recognise that because of the complexity and conflicting issues that are being brought to bear. Hopefully today, the point around the focus on one small part of your system in the wider context shows that level of complexity. And so these things do take time, because actually this is an area that is ultimately personal. It is hard to describe anything more personal than the loss of a loved one and their treatment thereafter. And it is very individual. Therefore, you do have a wide range of opinions to take into account. At some point, you need to make that decision as to where you're going to settle that. But we believe we can bring that wider mix to the discussion.
Thank you. Mr. Popovic, do you have anything further you wish to add?
No, I think just from my side, just the opportunity. One of the questions that was asked is why we've been so late to be involved in this process. I guess if we were to invert that question with a comment to say it is regrettable that you weren't invited to these kōrero from the outset. I believe that by having this as a model, I've obviously Tūranga's Kia as the first in terms of daylight to everything else. I see this as being just another model to that, as extended model of that. And if we're going to do it, I think we can do it right. We have the support of us, the frontline clinicians. We have a national hearing in terms of informative information on our own frontline experience. I think that can only benefit the fuller outcome that we desire.
Thank you. I will just say that the committee does have the ability to adjourn the final consideration with it subject to some time frame of which further work might happen around only those specifics that have been raised in this paper. So I mention that because you all can think about that, and obviously council officers will give us some advice before the close of the hearing today. Thank you. And it's not something that council wants to put off for a long time because it's very important to the successful completion and our meeting our standards with respect to our wastewater consent. We've run through to 10 o'clock, so I now just note that we'll break for morning tea and we will listen to Mr. Alistair Bayliss from Ovation immediately at about 10 past 10 because we are running a little early because someone didn't come. So there's tea and coffee down there, so feel free to help yourself and we'll reconvene at 10 past 10 with a presentation from Mr. Bayliss. Thank you very much. Thank you. So, Mr. Alistair Bayliss for Ovation, and anyone who is speaking with you, if you would like to come forward, and for us, the submission is on page 12 of our pack. Thank you. Those two, yes. And you can sit or stand when you give your presentation, and we just put the little button on, and you don't have to speak right close to it. It picks up our voices. No, you just push it on and it'll stay on. Thank you. Thanks.
Good morning.
Just introduce us so we know who else is speaking with you. Thank you.
I'm Alistair Bayliss, the General Manager of Ovation, and I've got Albert Van Nystrom here, who's our trade waste advisor to the business.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name.
Albert Van Nystrom.
Thank you. Just so we can, so I can speak back to you and be courteous and understand the correct pronunciation of the name. Thank you.
Just to kick off, I guess for those of you unfamiliar with Ovation, we're a specialist sheep meat processor and exporter. We have facilities around the country. Our one locally here is about 10 minutes south of town on Dunstan Road. We operate a year-round operation and employ about 200 people year-round and a further 125 on a seasonal basis, generally to cope with that peak demand from October through to April, roughly. We make a large contribution to the local economy, not only from an employment perspective and payroll perspective, but also through actively supporting a number of local businesses and organisations. We've obviously put a submission forward, and we've raised three main areas of concern, which we'll just add some emphasis to today and take questions on those. Our critical issues around colour, really, of those three concerns. However, the other two are also of importance to us. I'll touch on the duration of the consent, and then I'll hand it over to Albert to talk to the other two issues as they are more technical in their nature. However, the first one was in regard to a change of ownership and whether consent will be available should there be a change of ownership to the new owners. That was in the agreement and the bylaw prior to this proposed new bylaw, and the verbal feedback we've had on that matter is that by having it in there creates an expectation that there's almost an automatic right to a consent should a new owner take control of a business. We don't believe that wording that's in there leads to that conclusion at all, and gives the council the ability to withhold a consent if there's been a history of non-compliance or if there is a change in the sewage being discharged. So, and it would certainly have it in there, give confidence, not that we're contemplating selling, but it would give confidence to prospective sellers or buyers that it wouldn't be a major roadblock if that history is there. So on the colour and load limits, I'll hand it over to Albert.
Thank you.
Okay. The proposed bylaw, as written, prohibits any colour change of any colour change in the sewer is caused by a discharge. Okay, which basically will prohibit almost all discharges. All discharges will cause an increase in colour to some degree in the sewer system. In Ovation's case, they produce effluent that sometimes has, and it's treated effluent after going through a pre-treatment system, has a green or red tinge to it, some chlorophyll in the case of the stockyard waste has been treated. There's still a bit of residual green colour in the wastewater. And sometimes there might be some hemoglobin in the wastewater as well, and that causes a reddish tinge. And as it is, in the treatment system that's been operating has been operating for over 10 years now, I believe, and producing some colour in the sewage system. But we understand that no colour occurs at the final discharge into the ocean after dilution with other waste streams, because Ovation's wastewater is a relatively small portion of the total discharge. So as we understand it, there's
colour has not been causing an issue in terms of Ovation's wastewater, but the bylaw as written is concerned with colour change in the sewage system without actually linking that colour change to effects in the final discharge. In the 2015 bylaw, a non-compliance occurs if the colour is to an extent that causes an issue at the final discharge. It's been changed to be a lot more stringent. Ovations is seeking that the 2000, a couple of options. One is a rewording of the relevant clauses in the existing in the proposed bylaw. Well, probably, in my view, probably the best wording would be to just continue to adopt the colour standard in the existing 2015 bylaw.
Thank you. Can I just ask about, and I'll let, because I know you've got another point as well, but let's deal with the colour one first. What options are there with respect to treatment at Ovation's premise? If that were to be required, what would that require of Ovation to remove colour?
Okay, if they would need to install biological treatment, okay, at a cost of $3 to $5 million in order to reduce colour to a level. Well, the thing is, there'll still be some colour in the wastewater. It'll change from a red or green colour to a slightly tea colour after biological treatment. So technically they still would be non-compliant, but there'll be less colour.
Just a different colour.
A different colour, and there'll be less of it.
And, and it becomes far more dilute once it's added to the total system.
Absolutely. But as it is, the dilution we understand is adequate to avoid any issues with colour.
Thank you. So, did you have any other questions around colour? Yes, we'll deal with colour first.
I just ask staff about the colour, okay, I'd just like to know what the issue is at the wastewater treatment plant with colour and the consequences. I mean, we're hearing that it's not going into the receiving environment as colour, but how is the mixing and what's the consequences of colour, and has there been issues in the past?
So yes, there have been issues in the past. So one of the reasons we worded it, how we worded it in this particular one, was that we've got the ocean outflow consent, which is our wastewater discharge into the ocean, our consent there, which says that we cannot cause a plume in the bay. So that's part of the RMA. So even without that clause in there, that stands as part of the RMA requirements. So we have no further treatment of the industry separated line. So we've got obviously the domestic line and the industry separated. So we have had instances in the past where we've actually colour turned up at the wastewater treatment plant in the line that comes from the industrial waste, so industrial separated line, and has caused colour in the final discharge, even with the mixture of the domestic group mixed in. So one of the reasons that we also wanted to do it so the compliance point is at the industry, but one of the reasons we said that we wanted to have it at that point and that it doesn't cause problems downstream is that we have had issues where a colour has been removed through a chemical process and then mixing with the sewers downstream returned that colour. And so it's really quite important for us, because if we cause a plume in the bay, then council is non-compliant with that consent. And because there's no further treatment and no opportunity to do that at the wastewater treatment plant, then we have to have that compliance point at the industry. Hope that answers that.
So supplementary to that then, thank you, which was really helpful. What conversations and are there other industries impacted in the same way?
So there are other industries that are already treating for colour. So they're not doing it through a biological treatment, they're doing it through chemical removal. Through a chemical removal, so bleaching. So in the industry separated line, that's quite important because we have no further treatment. But also in the domestic, if you had a lot of colour coming in, then that could cause issues depending on what that colour profile is on the actual biological treatment of the biological treatment filter. So even that's quite important in the domestic line as well as the industry separated line.
And so the bleaching, is that ammonia, or what is the bleaching meant? And is that better or worse than the colour?
So
Because it all ends up in the outfall in the end.
yes, so they're actually putting the chlorine, which is I think just hypochlorite, into the wastewater there, and then actually removing that chlorine through another chemical method and going out. So basically they're complying with the bylaw by doing that. And the effect on the wastewater, again, you've got dilution, but you've also got that inactive chlorine that's been removed. So effectively you've removed the colour, you've removed the chlorine, and then it's discharged.
And where does that end up?
So that's on the industrial separated line. So that goes out to the ocean, mixes with the domestic and then carries on.
So it still ends up in the same place.
Still ends up in the same place. So the industry separated line and the domestic all go out to the same discharge pipe in the bay.
Thank you. Councillor Corrigan?
Just a point of clarification, Madam Chair, you were asking where the separated chlorinated
Yes.
waste that was removed. So is that, just for my clarity, that ends up going back into that the same wastewater discharge space? Or you're talking about?
Still goes into the bay.
Yeah, it still goes out into the bay. So the stuff that's used to treat that colour and then separate it out, that still ends up going out to the bay, you were saying?
So the chlorine acts in a way to bleach out the colour, so it takes the colour out.
Yep.
So then the next process is to remove that chlorine.
Yep.
So that now decoloured, dechlorinated water is what's going to the industry separated line and out to the bay. Yep.
And I believe that the question there was about the chlorinated stuff that's removed.
It just shows the air. It just comes off.
Just
Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, that wasn't clear. Thank you, councillor. Right. Any further questions? Thank you. Thank you. Back to your presentation.
Okay. The other matter was that some of the trade waste limits are lower than apply at the outfall consent discharge by about between 90 and 80% of trade waste discharges are expected to meet a standard that's 80 to 90% of what the council is expected to meet at the outfall after treatment. And I understand that's provided as a buffer to make it easier for the council to comply with their consent. But I contend that creates a situation where a trade waste discharger could be compliant with what the council is required to meet, but non-compliant in terms of the consent to discharge. And I see that as an inequitable situation, an unjust situation, and propose a remedy that could be, and that's the final sentence of the submission. If a limit is exceeded, but the exceeded parameter is compliant with discharge limits at the ocean outfall and does not cause adverse effects in the sewage network or at the GDC wastewater treatment plant, enforcement action will not be taken, but the consent holder shall investigate the exceedance, undertake remedial actions, and if requested, provide an incident report to the district council. So that's basically a way of avoiding a situation where the company is penalised when there is no actual penalty to the council itself in terms of its own discharge.
That's very clear, thank you. Any questions, councillor Foster? Perhaps council officer, I think I understand what you're doing, but maybe for the benefit of the hearing process, can you explain why it's been felt a need to reduce that particular quantum?
So the limits that are already in the ocean outfall consent were in the previous bylaw and have been in successive bylaws prior, as that sort of 10 to 20% below the limit in the outfall consent. And it is basically to give us a buffer so that if we've got issues with compliance coming through, that we don't tip over into our non-compliance. So having that lower limit just means that the same process would happen, whether they were above our limit or above the 20% limit. That we would ask them to investigate, find out what's going on, make sure there's a way not to have it before, So yeah, it's just, so the only one that's been added in this bylaw is the intercoco level. And so we kept that consistent with what had been applied prior.
Was it, I'm sorry, I missed the last word, what's been consistent with?
With what had already been in the bylaw, the other conditions. Yeah. So for example, suspended solids. So our ocean outfall consent is 600 grams per cubic metre and the bylaw is 540.
Is there any way this is being used or reduced to enable, I mean, to penalise one industry that might be compliant, but it leaves some freeway for others who might not? I mean, it could be deemed to be a penalty on one substantial provider, but allows space for others who are maybe not compliant, not to cause council then to breach its bylaw, because in actual fact, you've got a mechanism to monitor the Tradeways bylaw for any particular industry, haven't you?
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, the downstream effect of that is whichever that limit is, that would be the same final outcome. We'd go and investigate, find out why, and find out how they could do that. The buffer there, I guess, is if you're looking at dilution, which I think is what you're suggesting, is that, you know, one industry might be compliant and within that buffer, but other industry who are not would still mean that we would be compliant to the wastewater treatment plant. The downside though is that you can't guarantee that each of them are going to be under in a significant way to make sure that as there is any dilution that we end up with non-compliance. So again, this is the limit implied in there because of the ocean outfall consent. So we need to make sure that we're compliant with that.
Are you able to help us? And I'm you know, it might be unreasonable, but you, because this is the first recent bylaw we've done in relation to respecting our ocean outfall and taking into account, how do other local authorities manage that? Do they have a buffer in it that protects the end game and yet potentially on the way penalises industry? Are you able to make any comment about that?
I know there are other councils that do trade-based bylaws where their discharge consent is, the trade-based limit is lower than the discharge consent. Not sure what it just into.
Do you have any information, Mr. Wilson?
For you, Madam Chair, I haven't got any specific examples. The issue that we're trying to resolve is that we can't be the solution via the dilution that we manage because we don't manage our inputs that are coming into the wastewater treatment plant. So it's very difficult for Tracy and the team to know what's coming down the pipe that it will be able to stay within our consent limits. So as part of this trade-based bylaw, we're trying to manage our ability as the consent holder to make sure that we will be compliant so that we're not going to be hit from regulatory ourselves. So with us being the buffer for everybody else, we inherit that risk as the consent holder, which is something we're trying to mitigate against.
I completely get what you're trying to limit and I totally understand where it's coming from, but I also understand what industry is saying, that if they are required to meet the standard and there's a monitoring regime that sits over the top of them and can pick them up, is it necessary for us to create that freeway, if you like?
Through you, Madam Chair, there are occasions where industry are unable to comply with their conditions, which means that we don't comply with our conditions as well.
Thank you.
So it is the buffer, and if everybody was in a perfect world, then fine, but mistakes can and do happen.
Thank you. And back to you, gentlemen, with respect to your submission. We will have to debate that amongst ourselves, and we will allow you to hear council officers' response, which I'll invite council officers to respond before we make any final decisions. Did you have some other points?
We've covered off the points that we've made. Yeah.
Councillor.
I believed you had brought up a point about length of consent. I don't believe that you'd spoken to that. Just
sorry, it was under duration of consent. That was where a change of ownership.
But there were two issues within that change of ownership. One was to not unreasonably be withheld, and then you did talk in your submission around 5 years as opposed to annually.
No, we didn't cover. That was another company, I think.
Oh, sorry, it is two. I'm with you now. I can see where I got that information from. Do you have anything further you wish to say to us?
No.
Do you want to just confirm your points then, or do you want to affirm anything for benefit of council officers or ourselves? Or you're pretty happy with your,
Just on the colour, I believe it's very subjective, and I don't believe that there's a, we're not aware of any breaches based on our colour discharging in the past, and also with the breaches for the tradeway system in terms of the loadings as well. That would require us to be lower than the council limits. Certainly not my history with the company, which has been 12 years.
thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you. So now we will hear from Carla McCulloch on behalf of Sudenco. Thank you very much. We have a paper that you have tabled. Is this Mr. Hamill with you? Thank you. We have your paper. We haven't actually had time to read it. It was given to us at the beginning. So if you'd like to work through it or speak to it, that would be helpful.
Sure, no
Thank
problem. Good morning. My name is Carla McCulloch and I'm the General Manager of Sudenco Foods. I have with me Keith Hamill from River Lake Limited. And thank you for the opportunity to let us speak in support of our submission. Sudenco is a significant New Zealand fruit and vegetable processor. We employ 80 permanent and 400 seasonal staff and make a significant contribution to New Zealand's GDP through the processed food products we export to many countries around the world. We generate over $30 million each year to the Gisborne economy through freight requirements, supplier payments, service and staff wages.
Oh, excuse me, sorry, we have read that one. It was just the information Mr. Hamill tabled, we haven't read. But very happy to draw out points in that, but we have had the Sudenco submission and we have read all of that. So just if you want to speak to the issues around the trade waste.
Sure.
In that without the background, because we do understand and we have read that, but it's just when you come to present, that's new material that we've just received this morning.
All right,
Thanks
sure.
very much.
Okay. So for us, the process for applying for the renewal of a trade waste consent can be time consuming and costly. We feel that the time period for the duration of trade waste consents could be extended. Currently it's sitting 12 months. We think the period should be longer because it does create business uncertainty for us. We have to buy in seed to grow crops and we have to plant crops around August, September. So when we're struggling to work through consent, to get our consent, it does leave us in a very vulnerable position. We're happy to work through management plans, but we would feel if we could have a consent run for longer, that would give us more certainty around our business. We're also concerned with the proposed VOD limits. Currently, it is not clear if we would be made to meet a VOD limit. At any time, this could be added to our annual consent. And again, this provides considerable uncertainty and makes long-term planning very difficult. We believe that the guideline material should be available alongside with this trade waste bylaw review. Also, we're concerned about the intracocci levels proposed in the draft bylaw. We believe this indicator has been incorrectly applied to industry discharges where there is no human discharges involved. And Keith will speak to more about that point.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you. So Sudenco has made a submission in the trade waste bylaw, and I've been asked to provide some expert evidence to inform that submission, particularly in relation to intracocci bacteria. So my name is Keith Hamill. I run a small company called River Lake Limited, we're an environmental company. So my specialty I'm bringing to this is in terms of water quality and ecology. So I can't help you with any questions about how that waste is treated. What else can, but in terms of the effects of that waste and appropriate monitoring standards and indicators, that's where I can help. So the key points of my evidence that you have before you relates to the use of enterococci and E. coli bacteria as indicators of human health. And the key point I'm making there is that if you're interested in a good indicator of what's of human health risk, E. coli is what we would normally use and is the best indicator to use for freshwater streams, and particularly freshwater streams coming out of wastewater treatment plants. Enterococci is a good indicator in the marine environment, and so would be a good one for beach monitoring. And the reason this is important is that because under some circumstances, enterococci bacteria in particular can grow naturally in the environment and in some wastewater systems. And when this occurs, enterococci, using it as an indicator, can confound water quality assessments and give a false indication of there being a health risk when there is not, or there may not be. And this is the situation with the untreated and treated waste from Sedenco, which is the untreated waste has these very high concentrations of enterococci, resulting from the growth of the enterococci in the wastewater itself rather than external contamination. So I can speak a little bit more fully to that. I'll skip over section 2, let's straight to section 3. But on your hands a little bit if you want me to read verbatim or just to
yes, I think you should. It's important.
Yes, okay. So I'm just going to skip to section 3
3.
because section 2 is really just qualifications who I am.
Yeah, 3 is fine.
Yeah.
Maybe even starting at 3 too.
Yeah. So enterococci and E. coli are commonly used as fecal indicator bacteria to assess the likelihood of fecal contamination and the consequent health risk in waters. And these organisms are used because they are common in feces of warm-blooded animals and that persist in the environment reasonably well. Some strains of E. coli and enterococci can be pathogenic, but most are not, and many enterococci are beneficial commensal organisms. E. coli bacteria is a preferred indicator in freshwater environments. Enterococci is a preferred indicator in the marine environment because they are better correlated with health risks in these respective environments. So the New Zealand microbiological water quality guidelines, marine and fresh waters, are quite explicit about this. They say E. coli rather than enterococci should be used as an indicator wherever the primary source of fecal contamination is a wastewater stabilization pond or just in the wastewater system. Enterococci are damaged in the wastewater system process, whereas fecal coliforms that emerge from the pond appear to be more sunlight resistant than those that enter it. Thus, for wastewater treatment plant waste, enterococci are inactivated in the receiving water faster than fecal coliforms. And you could read fecal coliforms E. coli because E. coli is a subset of that. Furthermore, wastewater treatment processes often effectively reduce enterococci while being less effective at removing pathogens such as viruses. When your wastewater plants enter the marine environment, enterococci can be used as an effluent standard in the plant itself, so intereffluent, where enterococci is appropriate to use in the marine monitoring environment, say as a bathing water. So while enterococci are common in the gut of many animals, they can also grow and multiply in the natural environment from natural sources without any fecal contamination. So this is common in sand, sediment, mangrove swamps, aquatic vegetation decaying seaweed. I found it myself in Fiordland amongst seaweed, quite high concentrations, and algal mats and detritus. These environmental enterococci can occur in high concentrations, even in pristine environments. When this occurs, the use of enterococci as an indicator can confound that water quality assessments, and they give a false indication of there being a health risk, as I've said, when there may not be. E. coli also has been known to naturalize and grow in the natural environment, but it's much less commonly reported than enterococci. So the untreated processing waste from Sedenco has these very high concentrations of enterococci bacteria, so in the billions, 10 to the 9 in untreated waste. And this is due to the enterococci growth in the wastewater itself, rather than external contamination. It has been confirmed with fecal source tracking, and I understand it's been confirmed also with the species identification of the enterococci source using DNA techniques. Indeed, vegetal processing waste has long been recognised as providing a stable medium for growth of enterococci. So the extensive growth of this enterococci and Sedenco waste makes the use of this indicator as a fecal indicator bacteria really problematic in this particular case. Similarly, it is difficult to justify applying the proposed trade waste limit, 800 CFU per 100 mils 90 percentile, when there is a low risk of fecal contamination source, a low health risk. So the Sedenco discharge should still be treated. I'm not saying don't treat this waste, to reduce contamination of bacteria in the discharge and other stuff. But the proposed enterococci limit is likely inappropriate for the Sedenco waste. So, what's this all mean for the submission and yourselves? It's likely to be really challenging for Sedenco to treat its waste sufficiently to comply with the limit set in for enterococci. Sedenco notes in their submissions concerns about the duration of the consent. They seek an extended default consent duration period. And in my view, this allowing for a longer duration would be entirely reasonable and appropriate given the special nature of Sedenco discharge and this, I guess, the certainty they need in setting up systems to treat their waste and well, I guess from them their understanding of the costs and difficulty in setting up those systems. So I read through the response from the officers to that point and suggesting that there was a need for annual review because of funding mechanisms and other stuff. It seems they seem very weak arguments. You could apply the same argument to the wastewater treatment plant itself and say, why does this wastewater treatment plant have a 35-year consent instead of an annual consent? There are lots of other ways to deal with funding. So that's really just a question of certainty and working with these other discharges. So point 3.9, which is my last point.
Yes.
The Sedenco submission also flagged issues with enterococci as an indicator of health risk. One way to address the submission point is to set a limit in Schedule 1 for E. coli bacteria, which can be applied as an alternative to enterococci bacteria in special circumstances, as occurs with the Sedenco waste. And a conservative limit for this might be, say, 540, which is just aligning up with the national bottom lines for bathing water. Arguably, E. coli bacteria is a better indicator to apply as a default to waste that is not saline prior to marine discharge. It's probably a much more conservative indicator for the wastewater treatment plant itself. However, I do recognise that in the short term, GDC may also need to work within the constraints of its current consent, which focus on monitoring waste for enterococci bacteria. And I think that's a real problematic point here. You've got a consent clause, is it 44? One of the clauses that puts an enterococci limit on. And so you've got an indicator, enterococci, that's probably not appropriate for the wastewater plant, probably underestimating the risk of human health from the wastewater, but massively overestimating it from the Sedenco waste. But you're stuck with that consent. And I'm not sure how you're going to deal with that. But I guess you are one organisation, you have got ability to make recommendations. It's not just about today, but it's about how you go through in the future and deal with trade waste and in the long term.
Thank you. Can I just ask, did Sedenco raise those issues with Gisborne District Council officers in the planning stages for this bylaw?
Yes, we have.
That's my question for the staff, actually. Is the enterococci bacteria level that is coming from Sedenco affecting our GDC consent at the outfall
So
at present?
it isn't a consent condition right now.
Yeah.
But once we've done the upgrade to the wastewater treatment plant, then that will be a limit that we need to comply with. And so it would mean that the current discharges would make us non-compliant at the current levels.
Thank you very much for that submission. I do want to know in your in regards to your technical expertise, like I did like your paper and like the sentence that I did like the submission. The sentence that did stick out to me was your recognition of our short-term resource consent. Is there any way in regards to your level of expertise around acknowledging all of section 2 that you would see us being able to balance those resource consent needs and the practical things that you've seen inside what Sedenco has?
You mean within the constraints of the current consent wording?
No, I don't mean, because the consent, the wording of the consent is kind of outside of this.
Yes.
So in your expertise, how do we balance this in order to meet the realities of what you presented here? Also acknowledging that you recognise that there's short-term GDC resource consent compliances. Yeah, do you have any comments in regards to that and how to land that in regards to your area of expertise?
I think flexibility would be a very helpful thing. But the flexibility would be helpful, so duration would be a useful thing, and I guess setting up a system where I'm coming at it from a technical expert point of view rather than trying to navigate the politics or planning issues. Yeah. But the I would thought the main issue is health risk and dealing with genuine health risk. And the way I'm seeing this trade waste consent set up, and I don't know the history of that, but it's not dealing with genuine health risk in an appropriate way. It's pretending that enterococci is good indicator of health risk, and it often is, but in this case it's not. And enterococci is underestimating the health risk on the wastewater plant, and it's overestimating that health risk massively on Sedenco. I think that's the grapple that you have to deal with from a planning political point of view, and maybe it's a recommendation that looking forward that there's a review of that wastewater treatment numbers. Politically expressed, maybe. But that would be, if you're thinking of the good of the region and how are you dealing with, are you just, is this having trade waste, is that something that you perceive as a good thing for the region because it helps with the regional growth, or is it just a pain in the neck and you just want them to go away? And so these are grapple things that, as political things you have to think about. And if it's genuinely a good thing because you're looking for the good of the region, it's worth making some hard decisions and thinking long term, not just the problems we have in the immediate short term here.
It is the former. It needs to be a good thing to make us meet our criteria for our wastewater treatment plant, which impacts on the whole region. And it just happens that trade waste is a part of that, so it has to be a good thing for the region as a whole. That's why the effort is being put into it.
My question is, are you able to be able to achieve the level of enterococci coming out of Sedenco? And if you are, at what cost would that be? And what time frame would you need to be able to achieve that?
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot of investigation over the last 12 months because it's come on to us pretty quickly. We probably again be looking at biological treatment to get the numbers that we need to. We need to continue to clean up our water on a solids level so that we can treat enterococci well. We're definitely running trials at the moment to try and see how best we get to that point. It would be a considerable amount of money to get to under 800. We would be looking between $5 and $10 million. And then the operating costs on a treatment system would be again about $1 million a year treat. So that's kind of what we're working through at the moment.
And also the time that you're from the proposed 1 year consent, what would the time frame to suit Sedenco look like in a consent form over time?
It'd be like 5 years minimum. It'd be really good for a good start. We've had instances this season that we were unsure whether we could start processing because we didn't have a consent in place. So it would be really good to have a consent in place, and then we would grapple with the operational side of it through our management plan. That would suit us a lot better. Then we would know that we could still run without fear of not having our consent. If we don't have our consent, we can't run the whole side.
So on top of that, are you happy with the compliance regime that is in place at the moment with council to monitor your discharge?
Generally, yes. Yeah, we've done a lot of work on the system and what we're reporting on. Hasn't always been easy, I must admit. But I think this year we've proven that we can do it and that we've put a lot of time and effort into getting it right. And we would like to obviously keep improving on that.
Sure.
This is probably random, but your issues are not hugely different to the issues of ovation. Has there been any conversation around where bigger industries within the town have a shared industrial treatment process?
Yes, last year we met with Council Tracy and we did discuss those options. And as an industry group, we've come together and discussed as well. At this stage, we've decided that it wouldn't be appropriate for us to join together and have a joint treatment system. We are still working through with Tracy, possibly the community or council being able to treat industry waste, but I think that's not going any further as well.
Which is constrained by the volumes we can manage, I think, isn't it?
The site size, if you're going to do it at the treatment plant, it's where do you put it? The other thing is the different types of waste that are coming and the volumes that are coming at different times of the year. So obviously you've got sort of your major processing season where you're getting up to 9,000 cubic, 5,000 cubic a day. Cubic meters that is. So that's quite a lot. And then you have other times where you're just getting sort of a trickle in as well. So any treatment system has to be able to have that flexibility to be able to treat the large volume versus the small, but the volumes when they come through in that large time are quite difficult.
Thank you. So just to praise you, your main points are obviously the enterococci, but the timeframes.
Yes.
And anything else?
Just BOD, just not understanding what those guidelines will be around BOD limit.
Can we just explore that a little further? I note that council officer's response to that is on page 14 of our papers. I'll just let me quickly refresh that. Would you like to speak to that around exactly what those limits are intended to be, please, and how that might impact?
So the limit in there is 400 grams per cubic metre for BOD. So that was in the bylaw previously, and that was discussed as being, instead of making industry upgrade twice, to do it at the commissioning stage to get that compliance level in. So since then we have had discussions with industry, And at the moment, we've had correspondence letting them know that for now, we won't expect them to meet with that criteria. So it is moving out of the permitted activity into the conditional range. So limits may be set there, but the main point of it was the cause. So if we're having gas production, odour issues, treatment issues, any kind of corrosion, or we've got a limit put on us by either district or national plans. So if they come in, then we will need to enforce that, because we'll have to comply with that as well. So, so that correspondence has gone out.
So what will that mean then for your industry? Because it's not necessarily something you have to plan for immediately, but we've just heard it could happen. So what does that, I mean, that uncertainty, I guess, is what you're saying?
Definitely, because I think for us to again treat our order to meet that BOD level, we would have to go to biological treatment, and it would be between 5 and 10 million to do so. So yeah, it's a huge cost for our business. We have to go down that track, and I think it's just the uncertainty of, is that in a pipeline or is it not? Great that it's not currently, but would hate to, next year or the year after, in the short term, get to a point where we've done a lot of work on our treatment system, and then we're moving off in another direction.
So back to you, thank you. Are you able to give an indication of what those potential timeframes might be?
Unfortunately, no. It usually takes a while to get a plan in place, though. So if you're going national or district, you've got all the consultation time, the writing. So there's usually a good year in there that you would know about it to have to implement, well, and potentially longer to implement. Unfortunately,
a year to write the bylaw, and then a year
to write a district plan, or yeah. So we would be in the same situation. So the wastewater treatment plant, separate from the industry line, would also need to make sure that we're meeting that compliance level as well. So we haven't had really any indication of if, when, or what that level is going to be at this stage. So unfortunately, we're all in the same boat of hoping that things stay the same, but knowing things change. So, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I've just got a question for staff. What's the rationale of having a yearly consent as opposed to a 5-yearly consent?
Yep. So we're looking at the moment, everyone's a 1-year consent. So what we have found is that not necessarily the big industry, but the little other trade waste industry premises, they change hands quite a lot. So it's a good way just to check in, make sure that it is still the same owner, to make sure that we've got a management plan from them, make sure that if they're doing anything in that next year, that we've got an understanding of what it is, and that we're comfortable that they're going to be compliant. And that that sort of amongst that, and I guess we're talking about costs, but in amongst that, particularly for the industry one, we've got visits that are actually put into that. So when we come in, we're not charging an extra charge. So obviously, if we have to come back more often, then we would charge again, because it's time to do that. But yeah, so our rationale is basically just to be able to ensure that any changes that have happened, because things do change quite regularly, even amongst the bigger industry, about what they're doing, how they're doing it. So it's just a really good place to actually get confidence that you know who to talk to as well, because you turn over within industry. So it's all that sort of thing. Is that sort of why we've put it as an annual consent? It's a good review, and it's also a push for people to make sure that they have a current management plan and that they're going forward with that.
A couple of questions then. Could that be done with a monitoring process? And the other question that what time do you think that is imposing on businesses that you're on average? I mean, I guess it's depending on the size of the business, but how long does it take for a business to do its consent process?
For the business themselves, I'm guessing depending on the complexity of their business, as in the time it takes to write their management plan or amend it as necessary. The visits that we do, it depends on if they've got a waste management plan that we're comfortable or not, or whether we say, actually, we can't accept that, so you're going to have to change it. So one of the reasons we have the consent ending at the end of the year is that little bit of pressure to make sure that people do it rather than not. So a monitoring program would do it, but then you'd be charging every visit then in the way that you do it, plus the time for the risk management plan. So as far as cost reduction, I don't think that would actually reduce any time that they would spend or we would spend on that process. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Appreciate those matters that you've brought to us. Is there anything you want to say in summing up?
No, I just leading on from Ovation's discussion around colour, we also support. Yeah, it's also been an issue for us this year as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I appreciate that. Your information. Thank you both. We have no further oral submissions, but the panel has received a paper from Mr. Lawrenson, Mark Lawrenson, from Foresight on behalf of the oil companies, and in our papers it's actually addressed as a submission from Z Energy. So we'll just take a moment to read the paper that's been provided to us. Have council officers got it? Well, there was the original submission, and then there's the paper dated the 24th, the paper today. Just affirms the issue that's been raised with us previously. I'll invite council officer to explain why we are moving from the permitted trade waste to discretionary for the benefit of the hearing. Thank you.
So in the current bylaw, there is a permitted activity versus conditional. Just a bit of history is that the smaller industry had actually been classified as permitted in their consent, but actually not a permitted activity. So there's a little bit of confusion there. So they always have been conditional consents. And so anything that's basically needed treatment has had a consent, which has conditions in it on monitoring, compliance, timeframes, those sorts of things. So there's actually not a change that we're doing. We're probably just classifying it better.
So it's language more than anything.
Language more than anything, yes.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, one question. It's kind of not relevant to this, but it's a holistic. Later on next week, we're in operations. We're looking at the stormwater discharge on industry. So this and it doesn't indicate anything about it being under the trade waste bylaw. So I'm assuming that this is part of the consent process with the trade waste bylaw that we're looking at with stormwater.
The only thing that sort of is covered under the trade waste bylaw, because we're looking at what discharges to our wastewater reticulation, is the exclusion of stormwater from trade waste, so that we don't have to again treat that downstream. So the type of consent is a different one because it's discharge to the environment. So it's under RMA, not local government act. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's straight, the stormwater's consents are straight into the receiving environment, like
Yes.
straight to the streams. Okay, cool. No worries.
Thank you. Then we will invite the council officers to sum up, and I'm not sure, or make some observations around the points that have been raised. I'm not sure who's going to do that, or whether each of Ms. Patton and Mr. Wilson are going to take a turn. Well, up to you. So we're looking at some of those matters that have been raised, the extension of the time frame, the level of the measurement, and whether the measurement of colour should be measured as it enters the wastewater treatment plant or as it leaves the ocean outfall, the duration of the consent and why we need to have a 5-yearly consent. I picked up you suggested keeping track of who was running the business. We need to find a better way to keep a track of who's running a business than requiring them to renew a consent, I would suggest. So a range of those issues that have been raised with us with respect to what we've heard this morning. I'd like some comment given to us, please, on the extended issues. Disappointing that the submitters on behalf of the Funeral Directors Association have left the room, but there seems to be a little bit of room for further discussion on the transporting of that separated waste. So some comments around that, please, and what it might look like if 3 months was allowed to arrive at a mutually agreed position, if there was one.
So if we discuss, we'll start with mortuary waste, or we'll keep covering as we go. So in the bylaw at the moment, it is about the transportation and where that goes. So how it's transported and where it goes can be part of your consent. If it's chosen to go elsewhere, like discharged land, then that's a different process. So we're only worried about what comes to the sewer. So all we're saying in this one is that it can't go to us, it has to go to an approved point. What that approved point is whatever we decide in the future. So it's not set in stone at this stage.
That maybe needs to be made clear for them.
Yes. Which we may correspond with them later. Oh, sorry, David?
Through you, Madam Chair, if you're okay, I might cover off a number of the issues that you've just raised.
Thank
if that's
you.
all right. On the topic of mortuary waste, it is something that has been discussed as the committee are aware for a number of years.
It's actually quite hard to hear you from there, Mr. Wilson. Can you bring your speaker to the table in front and speak to us from there? Thank you. It's okay to stay there. David can sit beside you. It's just really hard to hear.
So through you, Madam Chair, there are a number of issues that we'll just quickly cover off now, and happy to take questions from the panel. So for the issue of mortuary waste, it is something that's been discussed by council with the community since the 1950s, as Mana Whenua said in their submission. It's something that we have raised with the local funeral home for a number of years, and we've been working with the Parkers. I know since my time, since 2012, we've been working on this issue with the Parkers. Some committee members remember back in 2015, we've been in dialogue since then, since this issue was raised. We have met with the Funeral Directors Association, and there were a number of issues that staff have with their submission around our correspondence. We have been in correspondence with the FDA NZ via email and also by phone. We have met with them. We've talked to them about the solution is one that is uniquely tairāwhiti because it aligns with the tikanga of our mana whenua, and it is something that they have put forward. We understand there may be implications for other parts of New Zealand. However, this is a solution that we believe can work for us here within tairāwhiti under a trade waste bylaw. As Ms. Penton talked about, the bylaw talks about prohibiting it going into the Gisborne wastewater system. It doesn't mandate what system can be used, and providers would be able to take it to a different location if they wanted to. This is a solution that we've worked with behalf of our community to bring up as a way to deal with mortuary waste going forward. So it is not the only system. If the FDA NZ wanted to come back with an alternative, then we would work through a normal consenting process with them to do that. We have unsuccessfully we haven't been able to get an alternative from the FDA NZ, so they have alluded to different options, but they haven't given us one to consider as yet. They've just said that they're willing to open up a process to talk through different options, but they haven't said what they could be from what's been proposed. But as we said, the bylaw doesn't prohibit them from doing another process if they wanted to. Are there any questions on mortuary waste before I cover to the next parts of it? In regards to the intracocci limit, oh, sorry.
Yeah, actually, whatever system you had in place, you would have to separate at source that waste, whether it's in a septic or whatever. So there's no other way that you could separate it without having a collection system.
Yes. And I must just give respect to David Parker and the team at Evans Funeral Service. They've been fantastic helping staff understand the logistics of what we are discussing. So the Evans Funeral Service have been really good and have really helped inform a number of things that we have done in the development of this as well. In regards to intracocci, that is something that is set through the resource consent for the wastewater treatment plant. As Ms. Panther pointed out, there is the limits which are not enforced at the moment for us when it comes to intracocci. When we commission the phase 2 of the wastewater treatment plant, which the panel would be aware we're breaking ground on that process at the moment, that is when those new limits come into enforce for us as the consent holder for the wastewater treatment plant. That is something that has been in our resource consent since we were first given it 10 years ago. So it has been something that has always been there. The Wastewater Technical Advisory Group and Ovation has been consistent around that they will struggle to reach the limits for that because of intracocci being the marker that is there. But that's something through the consent process. It's not something we're able to deal with through the trade waste bylaw process as it currently stands because it's a consenting issue. When it comes to BOD and also around colours and things being in our wastewater system. So I'll deal with BOD first. BOD is a limit that we know that is going to be changed through the National Direction for Water. We know that that is something that a limit is going to be come in by. In our first draft, we had jumped to those limits and after consultation with industry agreed to wait until it was set at a national level before we introduced those into the trade waste bylaw. And industry quite rightly pointed out, depending on where we put that limit for BOD has massive financial implications for them as an industry if we chose that when there's a discussion happening at a national level that may be different. So that's why we're waiting to see what happens at a national level. Why we're wanting to manage BOD going forward now is because the impact that it can have on our pipes and on our processes. So it can be quite harsh on our infrastructure, which is why we want to work with each of the industry suppliers to make sure that we know how we can set those BOD limits so that it's not going to have an undue impact on our wastewater treatment plant and the systems that we have. So pipes, pumps, those kind of things. So we're happy to wait until we know what's happening at a national direction. And we also understand that industry will be having those conversations at a national level when those come through as well. When it comes to the colour being in our wastewater system, we understand the approach from industry. However, as the consent holder, we also have to be compliant with our marine outfall. And what we're trying to do through this trade waste bylaw is manage the inputs that are coming in so that if we have got any issues that arise, that we still have a buffer which sits within our volume of water that goes out. What we don't want to be is the solution by dilution for industry, because it means that we are then taking the risk on as the consent holder, because we have to make sure we've got those flows going through at the right times to then counter the colours or the different types of waste that are coming through. We have got buffers for some of those things because as the hearings panel will be aware, sometimes machinery can break, there can be mistakes, so we need to have that buffer there for those occasions. As staff, we do not want those to be put forward as a BAU way of dealing with some of those wastes going forward.
Any questions on that one before we move to the next?
Sure.
Yeah, I've got a question. It's a scenario. I mean, at the end of the day, if we're looking at a wetland down the track as well, would trade waste go to that wetland?
Through you, Madam Chair, it will depend on how we set the wetland up and the volume. Our intention would be for it to go through. However, there's different iterations of the wetland where size and scale would be the difference for it, because for a wetland, if we took industry waste, it would have to be able to scale up significantly during production season, but then have to drop back for the other 9 months of the year, potentially when we don't have those volumes. The intent would be to get it there eventually, but it'd depend on which option we go forward with.
Yeah, the other question would be, if that was in place, would that appease the colour and all the other enterococci that are going into the supposed marine environment? If we went through that and the processes for a wetland would treat that accordingly?
Through you, Madam Chair, there'd be issues with enterococci and colour going through a wetland, and whether or not, and part of the issue why I was hesitant around industrial waste going through into a wetland is because it can get large volumes of things dumped on it. And I don't mean that offensively, it's just when trade waste kicks in, depending on who's processing what, it can change the type of wastewater that we're receiving at Bank Street quite quickly. If we shock that into a wetland environment, we could end up tipping over and killing some of the good bacteria that are in there. And it's the chemicals and things, and we have issues with our current plant now when we get big volumes coming through of a type of waste. Not necessarily nasty, it's just that significant volume will kill the bugs that we want to manage.
And I just had one question about that. Is there any room to move on that gap that we've got, or the gap that we're leaving for as a buffer? The buffer is the quantum of the buffer. Is there any opportunity for council officers to shift that buffer limit, recognising what our investors have said to us, but also the panel are hearing why council officers want the buffer? Is there any movement in there? We can adjourn,
Can we come back to you on that if that's okay, Madam Chair?
Yeah, happy to have time to come back to us on because there's 2 or 3 technical things, and at the end of the day, you know, the bylaw has to work for our wastewater treatment plant in the end, but it also can't be too punitive on our industry, or that is not helpful to our town. So somehow we need to find a way that meets the requirements of Gisborne District Council without being unduly punitive. So we might give council officers the opportunity to work on some of those things and see what we can come up with.
The only comment I'd make without caucusing first would be any buffer is very difficult to allocate to a certain user at a certain time.
Oh, it couldn't be. I'm not suggesting that for a moment. It would just be what is that standard buffer that we're talking about being at one level in here, and that would have to be the level. All I'm asking is that at council's point, is there room to move on the level of that buffer? Thank you. Back to you again.
I think I've covered the 3 topics that you asked us to provide comment on. Are there any further?
Yes. Yes. One was the time frame. I mean, we heard an explanation a moment ago, but we know the process of consenting has mechanisms in it which allows notice to be given around change of ownership and a variety of other things. Is there some opportunity for 5-year consents with conditions?
We've got the annual now to extend that consent. We might actually talk about that one too. Sorry, David.
Again,
through you, Madam Chair, I would be fine with looking at extending the timeframes for it as long as there was increased monitoring and increased compliance from industry to then be able to go to a 5-year consent. To be blunt, there are issues around compliance, and I'm not saying that towards any of the stakeholders, the submitters that have been here today, but as a whole with the trade waste industry, we do have issues with compliance, which is why we like the yearly checks to go in to ensure, to find out what the plan is for production season, what has been resolved from last year to this year. So that doesn't necessarily have to be around the time of the consent, but it would definitely mean increased monitoring and compliance as part of that process in order to be able to get a 5-year consent.
Yes, exactly. I mean, you'd still be monitoring it anyway, and there could be some requirement to, and in a different regime, I know your first consent might be 1 year and my next one might be 2 years. I mean, just seeking some flexibility. Councillor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Chair. That was going to be the general direction of my questioning to staff is it would be great if you were able to come back with us on certainty on how some of those increase, because we're hearing from you that, and I'm hearing it clear that there are users of the trade waste system and our waste system that are very compliant and trying to do things correctly. And I'm sure that they also understand that there's a necessity to kind of have increased monitoring in other areas. Maybe we're still learning, mistakes happen, etc., etc. It'd be good to have a framework that we could kind of be able to agree to give our industry partners certainty in regards to their future economic viability and things like that.
Sure.
So I know we're talking about this now, but I guess the point about the yearly part that we have in the bylaw is actually just a footnote. So it's not actually a requirement in the bylaw to have a year. At the moment, it just states that we generally do annual at the moment. I think we're probably reasonably open to having what David was saying before, which is having increased monitoring, compliance. Then we could look at going for longer periods of time.
Yes.
So that would be on a case-by-case basis with the industry. But
I
it
think
doesn't.
you can hear
It doesn't
what industry
stop.
is saying. If
Yeah.
we're asking on the one hand for substantial work to be done to meet a requirement here, then surely we need to respond to that by giving industry some confidence that it can have its business subject to meeting a variety of monitoring conditions for a longer period of time. I've won a couple more. The matter of the trade waste consent on the change of ownership of premises shall not be unreasonably withheld. I think that seems a reasonable, if we end up with notice that requires notice to be given where ownership of a matter that's in place in other monitoring regimes in this organisation, I know that we would require a notice of a change of ownership, but that the clause that was previously there maybe put back in, I think. If you could look at that too. And then the other thing which we haven't discussed because it's less of a bylaw issue and it's more directed to council officers, the guidance note. And the guidance note sounds like it's not prepared yet. And I just wonder if you can explain for the submitters, at what stage do we anticipate the guidance note's going to be available? Because it seems to the panel that it should be available at the time at which the new bylaw becomes effective. So we're not saying to someone, here's the bylaw, but we're still working out the guidance notes. So can you tell us what stage is the guidance note at? Because we understand from a number of submitters, some detail has been removed, which is relevant, fair enough, and we're happy with that, as long as the guidance notes are going to be available.
So they are being prepared now. So we haven't completed that, and we need to do but it's been developed, and the guidelines will be the guidelines will start. So how we're going to run it. So some of that stuff's been taken out now. So I expect that probably finished. Unfortunately, not through a bylaw if it goes through today.
Bylaw's not going to be going through today if we're waiting for some feedback from council officers.
Yeah. So yeah. So I think that the industry secret line is to renew in June. So we and the recent consent renew in September. So we definitely get it done for the June consent renewal, and then we'll apply.
So in effect, once the bylaw potentially becomes available, both documents will be available for applicants at the same time. That's what we're asking. Thank you. So can I just check that the committee secretary's got a note of those matters, which, thank you very much. Pardon? Sorry? Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Wilson, do you have anything further you wish to say with respect to the process? I might need some guidance. How long can we can adjourn, and how long will we need for that material to come back to us? And is that a public process, or can the panel review the data and make a decision around it for the benefit of our submitters.
Through you, Madam Chair, we could adjourn now to quickly come back to you on some of the matters that are just sitting here with us. So if we would have 10 minutes to discuss the next steps for it, it's up to you how you want to take your deliberations.
Right.
Or
I'm
would you like more
impressed
time?
that you can get this information in 10 minutes. Thank you.
It's
Okay.
a conversation between Ms. Banton and I. It's
Right,
well,
we'll
that's
adjourn
introductory.
until 11:45. Thank you very much. Thank you to the submitters. Apologies. Thank you for considering those matters. Can you like to give us some feedback? Thank you.
Certainly. Thank you, Madam Chair, and we appreciate the adjournment. So the four matters that we have raised that we've discussed, the first one was around the buffer levels that have been set currently. So at the moment, it's an 80-20 split effectively. That is for the permitted levels right now. What we are more than happy to is to look at individual plants on a case-by-case basis for people who want to go higher than those limits through the consenting process. So while the permitted levels are there at the moment, we feel comfortable that those give us the flexibility to then be able to consider through the consenting process other additionals, other inputs higher than that permitted activity. But we need to see what that looks like on a volume, on a timing, and on a case-by-case basis for those. So that is part of the consent process that this bylaw would not be coming in over the top of. We would still have the discretion to allow those through a consent process.
Thank you. Thank you.
For the next one.
That's great. Thank you. With the timeframes of the consent?
So through the duration, there's no duration set through the current bylaw as it sits at the moment. That sits within the guidance notes, and we are more than happy to look at that on a case-by-case basis again and work through with industry. So we can have that in the guidance material that will go up as part of the approval process to council on how the parameters are set for so as was mooted by Councillor Wharehinga, first year, and then looking at rights of renewal after that for compliance and monitoring that's appropriate as those get put forward, is what we'll be putting into our guidance note. For the transfer of title, originally we had removed because it was for, we cannot unreasonably withhold. Ms. Panton couldn't think of a reasonable reason to withhold, so we're more than happy with council must approve that unless there is must give a reasonable reason for transferring. So yeah, it's too hard for me to say, I tongue tie myself. So we're happy with that coming back in.
Just as a point of clarification, you're happy with the former wording that was in the bylaw around we cannot unreasonably withhold?
Yeah, so basically the reason we took it out was we sat there and said we wouldn't unreasonably withhold a consent anyway. And so we thought that was pretty much given in the bylaw. So we said it was kind of stating what we do anyway. So we wouldn't, if we have a reason to withhold, then we would, non-compliance, that sort of thing. But yeah, so it was almost like an extra statement. We didn't really feel it was needed. But as it's written, it's fine to go.
It does give clarity, I think, to the businesses if it's put back in.
Yep, and I'm fine with that. Yeah.
Thank you.
And on the last was around having the guidance material. We would have that by the 30 June council meeting so that would be there ready to go as part of the adoption. Those two would run in parallel. So we would update the guidance and be able to have that available for the adoption by that 30 June so that it gives that certainty to industry as well.
Thank you. And then with respect to the levels of measures, some of those are placed upon us by Ministry of Health and other agencies, aren't they? So there's something for the future, I think, with relative to water reforms, etc. Right, do we have any other questions? So the recommendations, and I want to be really clear about the changes that are made, so I will tidy up my own notes with respect to that. But the recommendation for today is that approve the Gisborne District Council Trade Waste Bylaw. And I do want to note that since mortuary water was, a very significant part of it, that amended recommendation or definition, as it should be called, which appears on page 6 of 64 at option 3, will be the definition that is used within this trade waste bylaw. And those other recommendations, the information that's just been provided to us, we'll see that that is written up to be clearer, regard to the buffer gap, the time frame, flexibility, and the change of ownership. Have I captured all the things that you need captured? Would one of the panel like to move that the revised Gisborne trade-based bylaw,
Yes,
as amended, be approved?
Yes, I'll move.
Moved Councillor Foster, seconded Councillor Forrihinger. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Contrary carried. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the submitters. We have listened to everything that you've shared with us, and some of our constraints are necessary for our own purposes. We hope that we've been able to alleviate some of yours, and I think there'll be quite a lot more conversation going on with Gisborne District Council and our council officers over trade waste into the future. So we hope we can meet on some more common ground as we go forward, and we thank you for bringing matters to our attention today. And thank you to council officers for your time on the project. Thank you very much, everybody.